Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you love stories about underdogs getting the last laugh, hit that subscribe button. It was a warm and sunny afternoon at the park. The trees swayed gently as a light breeze blew through the air. Children ran across the grass, their laughter ringing out like bells. Parents sat on benches, watching their little ones play. A man threw a frisbee for his dog, while another jogger passed by, earbuds in, lost in his music. Everything was calm. Everything was peaceful. Emma Hayes walked slowly along the sidewalk, her white cane tapping softly against the pavement. Step by step, she moved forward with a quiet confidence. Beside her, a golden retriever named Duke walked proudly, guiding her with steady steps. His body was strong, his ears alert, his eyes watching everything around him. To the people around him, Emma was just a blind woman out for a walk. Some people noticed her and gave a small smile. Others simply passed by, lost in their own world. A few people whispered to each other, curious but not brave enough to ask questions. "She's blind," one voice murmured. "Poor thing," another added. Emma heard them, but she didn't react. She was used to it. People often thought she was helpless. That she needed pity. That without Duke, she would be lost. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Duke wasn't just any guide dog. He had a past. A past that made him far more dangerous than anyone could ever imagine. Emma reached the park's entrance and paused. Duke stopped beside her, his tail wagging slightly as he waited for her next move. She took a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. This was her favorite part of the day. The fresh air, the open space, the sounds of birds singing in the trees, it all made her feel free. Even though she couldn't see it, she could feel it. She moved forward again, stepping onto the soft grass. Duke guided her carefully, leading her toward her usual bench. She counted her steps in her head. 1, 2, 3. On the 15th step, she reached out and touched the smooth wooden surface of the bench. She smiled. Right on target. She sat down, letting out a small sigh of relief. Duke sat beside her, his body pressed lightly against her leg, always close, always ready. For a few moments, everything was quiet. The wind rustled through the leaves. A little girl giggled somewhere nearby. The faint sound of a radio played in the distance. Then, she heard it. The deep, rumbling sound of motorcycle engines. Emma's grip on Duke's leash tightened slightly. She wasn't afraid, but she was aware. She had learned to listen, to pay attention, to sense things even before they happened. The engines grew louder. Closer. Then, they stopped. She could hear footsteps. Heavy boots crunching on gravel. Then laughter. Low, amused, almost mocking. "Hey, lady." A man's voice called out. It was rough, edged with something that made her skin prickle. Emma didn't react right away. She knew better than to respond to every stranger who wanted her attention. "Are you lost or something?" The voice continued, closer now. A second voice snickered. "Yeah, or did your little doggy forget the way?" More laughter. Emma kept her face calm, her body still. She had been in situations like this before. Some people saw her blindness as weakness. They thought she was an easy target. They had no idea how wrong they were. She felt Duke shift slightly beside her. His muscles tensed. It was subtle, but she could feel it through the leash. The bikers didn't know it, but Duke had already marked them as a threat. Emma took a slow breath. "I'm fine," she said simply, her voice steady. "Are you sure?" The first man said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "I mean, anything could happen to a blind lady in a place like this. Maybe you need some help." The second man laughed. "Or maybe a little company." Emma felt her fingers curl slightly against Duke's fur. She knew their type. They weren't just here to talk. She could hear them moving closer. Boots scuffing against the ground. The faint smell of cigarette smoke in the air. Duke didn't move. He didn't bark. Didn't growl. He was waiting. Emma knew that stance. She had felt it before. Duke was assessing the situation. Watching. Thinking. And if there was one thing she knew for sure. Duke never made the first move. But if they pushed too far, they would regret it. Emma kept her face calm, but inside, she was preparing. The men thought she was helpless, thought she was weak. They didn't know who they were messing with. Duke's body was still, but Emma could feel his tension. His breathing was slow and steady, but he was alert, waiting for her signal. The bikers had no idea that they were standing in front of a trained warrior. A soldier. A dog who had seen things they could never imagine. The first man took another step closer. Emma could hear his boots scrape against the ground. He was just a few feet away now. "You don't talk much, huh?" he said. His voice was laced with amusement, as if he was enjoying this little game. Emma remained silent. The second man chuckled. "Maybe she's scared." Emma still didn't react. She knew better than to show fear. Bullies like them fed on fear. If they thought she was afraid, they would push further. She could hear more movement. The men weren't alone. There were at least 3, maybe 4 of them. Their heavy boots shuffled on the gravel, circling slightly. Duke's tail flicked once. A sign. A warning. The bikers didn't understand, but Emma did. Duke was letting her know there were 4 men. 2 directly in front, 1 slightly behind, and another to the left. They were spreading out, surrounding her. Emma's jaw tightened. One of the men let out a slow whistle. "That's a nice dog you got there," he said. The way he said it made her stomach turn. "Yeah," the second man added. "Looks strong. Expensive, too. I bet a dog like that would sell for a lot of money." Emma felt Duke's weight shift ever so slightly. He was preparing. Waiting. "You wouldn't want anything to happen to him, would you?" Emma's hands curled into fists. That was it. That was the line. Threatening her was one thing. But threatening Duke? Unforgivable. Emma finally turned her head slightly in their direction. Her voice was calm, cold. "You should walk away." The first man let out a laugh. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Duke let out a low growl. It was soft, almost a whisper. But it was enough to make the laughter stop. The silence that followed was heavy. Emma could feel the shift in the air. The men were realizing, maybe for the first time, that something wasn't right. The second man cleared his throat. "Relax, lady. We're just talking." Duke didn't relax. Emma didn't either. The first man took another step forward. Duke moved fast. Too fast for them to react. He lunged not wildly, not recklessly, but with trained precision. He didn't bite, not yet, but he snapped his teeth just inches from the man's leg, forcing him to jump back with a startled curse. "Whoa! What the hell?" Emma didn't move. Didn't flinch. Duke stood firm, his ears pinned back, his muscles coiled. She could almost hear his thoughts. "Try me." The man who had been laughing a second ago suddenly didn't sound so amused. "What kind of guide dog does that?" he muttered. Emma tilted her head slightly. "Duke isn't just a guide dog." The first man wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his voice sharp with irritation. "Oh yeah? Then what is he?" Emma took a slow breath. "He's a retired Navy SEAL K9. Silence. Total silence. The bikers didn't speak. Didn't move. Emma let the words sink in. She knew they were looking at Duke differently now. He wasn't just a well-trained pet. He was something else entirely. Duke stood beside her, still, silent, powerful. One of the men let out a nervous laugh. Yeah, right. Emma just smiled. The first man narrowed his eyes. You expect us to believe that? She shrugged. Believe what you want. Duke let out another low growl. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. One of the men cursed under his breath. Dude, maybe we should go. The first man hesitated. Emma could hear the conflict in his voice. He didn't want to back down. He wanted to prove something. But deep down, he knew. If he pushed any further, Duke wouldn't hold back. Finally, he let out an annoyed grunt. Whatever. Let's go. The footsteps shifted. The sound of boots crunching on gravel moved away. Then the engines roared to life again. Emma listened as the motorcycles sped off, their thunderous rumble fading into the distance. And just like that, it was over. She let out a slow breath, relaxing her grip on Duke's leash. He sat down beside her, his posture still alert but his breathing calm. She reached down and stroked his head. Good boy. Duke didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to. He had done his job. Emma leaned back against the bench, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face again. The world around her returned to normal. The sounds of birds chirping, children laughing, the soft breeze rustling through the trees. No one in the park knew what had just happened. No one knew that just moments ago, 4 men had thought they could intimidate a blind woman. And no one knew how close they had come to learning a very painful lesson. Emma smiled. People underestimated her all the time. But the ones who judged by what they saw were always the ones who never saw it coming. The loud roar of motorcycle engines filled the park. Birds flew from the trees, startled by the noise. People on benches turned their heads. Parents pulled their children a little closer. Some joggers paused for a moment, watching. A group of 4 bikers skidded to a stop near a bench, their laughter ringing through the air. Their engines rumbled for a few seconds before shutting off. Then, silence. Emma didn't turn toward them. She didn't have to. She could hear everything. The shuffle of boots on gravel. The jingle of metal chains hanging from their jackets. The scratchy sound of someone rubbing his beard. They were watching her. Hey, lady. One of them called out. His voice was rough, like he had spent years yelling over loud music. Emma ignored him. She kept walking, Duke steady by her side. You lost or something? The man added, stepping forward. Emma kept her face calm. She had dealt with people like this before. People who thought blindness meant weakness. Duke slowed just a little, his steps more careful. Emma felt it immediately. A second man chuckled. Leave her alone, man. She can't even see you. Another one sneered. His voice was sharp, mocking. Bet she doesn't even know if that mud is leading her into traffic. Duke's ears perked up. His body stiffened just a little. Not a growl, not a bark. Just a shift. Emma knew that stance. She had felt it before. Duke was assessing a threat. She tightened her grip on his harness. Just a small squeeze, to let him know she was aware. To let him know she was ready. The bikers didn't know what they were walking into. Emma kept moving, steady, controlled. She counted her steps in her head, focusing on the rhythm. If they stepped in front of her, she would know. She heard boots scuff against the gravel. They weren't just watching her anymore. They were moving. Closing in. Her heart rate didn't change. Her breathing stayed calm. She had been in worse situations before. Duke stayed at her side, not pulling, not stopping. Just waiting. One of the bikers let out a low whistle. "That's a nice dog you got there." Emma didn't answer. "You sure he knows where he's going?" The man continued. "Wouldn't want you to walk into a tree or something." Laughter. Duke's muscles tensed under Emma's hand. She could feel it. The shift in energy. The way the air around them felt different. Duke knew. And if Duke knew, Emma knew. Another biker took a step closer. His boots crunched on the gravel. "Bet a dog like that costs a lot of money," he said. Emma didn't respond. "You think she'd notice if we took him?" Another voice, amused. More laughter. Duke didn't move. But Emma could feel his breathing change. A little shorter. A little sharper. The way a soldier breathes before a fight. She took a slow breath. "You should walk away," she said softly. The bikers stopped laughing. One of them scoffed. "Or what?" Duke let out a low growl. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. The air went still. Emma could hear the shift in their stance. The slight shuffle of feet. Someone clearing their throat. They weren't laughing anymore. "What kind of guide dog growls like that?" one of them muttered. Emma let a small smile touch her lips. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she said. One of them let out a nervous chuckle. "She's bluffing." Another one wasn't so sure. "That dog ain't normal, man." Duke stood still, his body coiled like a spring. Emma could feel the bikers hesitating. They weren't sure anymore. They were realizing too late that they had made a mistake. Duke didn't make mistakes. Duke didn't hesitate. And if they took one more step closer, they would learn that the hard way. The bikers stood there, silent for a moment. The laughter was gone. Emma knew exactly what was happening. They were looking at Duke. They were studying him, trying to figure out why a simple guide dog had reacted like that. One of them cleared his throat. "Relax, lady. We were just joking." Duke didn't move. His body was still, but his eyes, Emma could feel it, were locked onto them. He was watching. Calculating. One of the men took half a step back. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt it. The danger. Another one tried to laugh it off. "Yeah, come on, we were just messing around. No need to get all worked up." Emma said nothing. The first man, the leader of the group, wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. He let out a slow breath and took a step forward. "She can't even see us," he muttered under his breath. "She's just guessing." Duke's ears twitched. Emma didn't need to see them to know what was happening. She could hear the shift in weight, the way the gravel crunched under his boots. He was trying to convince himself that he was still in control of the situation. But he wasn't. Another biker, the one who had seemed nervous before, spoke again. "Dude, maybe we should go." The leader scoffed. "Go? Go where? This ain't her park." Emma finally tilted her head slightly. Her voice was calm. Controlled. "It's not yours either." The leader smirked. He thought she was bluffing. "You think you're tough or something?" Emma didn't answer. Duke let out another soft growl. The leader clenched his fists. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by a blind woman. "Look, lady," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I was just saying that's a nice dog. I mean, you wouldn't want someone to, I don't know, take him, right?" The moment he said it, Emma felt the shift. The energy changed. Duke didn't growl this time. He didn't need to. Emma heard it, the sharp inhale of breath. The slight movement of boots stepping back. The other bikers realized it first. This wasn't just a guide dog. This was something else. Something dangerous. The leader hesitated. What kind of dog is that? Emma turned her head slightly toward him. Her voice was quiet, but firm. The kind you don't want to mess with. The second biker was done. Screw this, man, I'm out. He took a step back. Then another. The leader was losing control. Are you serious? You're scared of a... Before he could finish his sentence, Duke moved. It wasn't a full attack. Just a shift. A lunge forward, controlled, precise. His front paws barely left the ground. But it was enough. The leader stumbled back, almost tripping over his own feet. His face went pale. The bikers froze. Duke didn't chase. He didn't bark. He didn't do anything but stand his ground. Emma reached down and ran a hand over his back. Good boy. The leader swallowed hard. His confidence was gone. That dog, there's something wrong with that dog. Emma finally smiled. Just a little. No. There's something wrong with you. The second biker grabbed his friend's sleeve. Come on, let's go. The leader didn't move at first. His pride was still fighting him. But after another long stare at Duke, he stepped back. Then, without another word, they turned and walked away. Emma listened as their footsteps faded. A few seconds later, their motorcycles roared back to life. Then they were gone. She let out a slow breath, feeling the tension leave her body. Duke sat beside her, his breathing steady. He was calm. As if nothing had happened at all. Emma reached into her pocket, pulled out a small treat, and held it out for him. Good boy, she murmured again. Duke took it gently from her hand. The park was quiet again. People had been watching, though no one had stepped in. That was how it was sometimes. People saw things, but they didn't always act. That was fine. Emma didn't need them to. She had Duke. She took a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face again. People underestimated her all the time. They thought they knew her. They thought they understood her life, her struggles. They saw a blind woman. What they didn't see was the truth. She wasn't weak. And Duke. Duke was her protector. Her guardian. Her soldier. And the next time someone made the mistake of thinking she was an easy target, well, they wouldn't see it coming. The bikers circled closer, their boots scraping against the gravel. Emma could hear every movement, every shift in weight. She had learned long ago that people gave themselves away with sound. The way they walked, the way they breathed, even the way they laughed, it all told a story. One of them let out a low whistle. Maybe she needs some company, he smirked. His voice was thick with amusement, as if this was just a game to him. Emma tightened her grip on Duke's harness. She could feel the change in his body. His muscles tensed, coiled like a spring, ready to move in an instant. She knew what Duke was doing. He was watching them, measuring them, deciding which one was the biggest threat. Back off, she said evenly. Her voice didn't shake. She had been in situations like this before. The lead biker scoffed. Or what? Your little puppy gonna bite me? Duke remained still. Silent. Watching. Waiting. The others laughed. They thought this was funny. They thought she was just a helpless blind woman with a dog. Emma took a slow, deep breath. She had learned to control her fear. She had learned that the moment you showed weakness, people like this took advantage. You have no idea what you're messing with, she said, her voice calm. The bikers laughed harder. One of them clapped his hands together. Oh yeah. Another one sneered. What's the mutt gonna do? Sit and roll over. Emma smiled. Just slightly. She felt Duke's energy shift. He was waiting for the command. The bikers had no idea what was about to happen. She tilted her head, her voice soft but firm. Duke, code red. The laughter stopped. In a blink, Duke sprang into action. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He moved like a shadow, fast and precise. Before the lead biker could react, Duke lunged at his leg not to bite, but to strike with force. The man stumbled back, cursing as he lost his balance and nearly fell. What the hell? The other bikers jumped back, startled. Duke didn't chase. He didn't need to. He stood firm, his body low, his sharp eyes locked onto them. Emma could feel the fear now. It was in their silence, in their sudden hesitation. One of them swore under his breath. What kind of dog is that? Emma stayed still, her hand resting on Duke's back. I warned you, she said. The lead biker straightened, trying to act tough, but his voice wasn't as steady anymore. That's not a normal dog. No, Emma agreed. He's not. The second biker glanced at his friend. Dude, maybe we should. The lead biker cut him off. He wasn't ready to admit he was scared. It's just a dog, he said, but Emma could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. Duke took a slow step forward. Not attacking. Just making sure they understood. Emma tilted her head slightly. Walk away. Now. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one of them muttered, screw this, man. Boots shuffled. A few of them backed up. The lead biker hesitated. He didn't want to lose face. But he wasn't stupid. His voice was tight when he spoke again. Whatever. Let's go. Emma didn't smile this time. She didn't move. She just listened. Listened as the bikers turned, listened as their footsteps crunched away. Listened as their motorcycles roared back to life. Then they were gone. The park was quiet again. Emma let out a slow breath, reaching down to run her fingers through Duke's fur. His body was still tense, but his breathing was calm. He had done his job. Good boy, she whispered. Duke leaned into her touch, his tail flicking just once. No one in the park had helped her. No one had stepped in. But that was okay. She didn't need them to. She had Duke. And Duke. He had never let her down. The park was silent again, but the tension in the air hadn't fully disappeared. Emma could still feel the weight of what had just happened pressing against her skin. The bikers were gone, but their presence had left a mark. People had watched. She knew that. She could hear the distant whispers, the murmurs of those who had been too afraid to step in but too curious to look away. She didn't blame them. She had never expected help. Instead, she ran her fingers through Duke's fur again. He was still standing at full attention, his body alert, his breathing slow but ready. Even though the threat was gone, he hadn't relaxed completely. He never did, not until he was sure. Emma knew better than to rush him. You did good, Duke, she murmured. Duke's ear twitched at the sound of his name, but he didn't move. His focus was still locked on the direction the bikers had gone. He was waiting. Waiting to make sure they didn't come back. Emma straightened her shoulders, listening to the world around her. The park was returning to normal. She could hear the soft laughter of children again. The distant bark of another dog. The wind moving through the trees. But her senses were still sharp. Her mind was still wired for danger. She had learned long ago that just because someone walked away didn't mean they were gone for good. She waited. 1 minute. 2. Then, finally, Duke let out a long breath and sat down beside her. That was the signal. The threat was truly gone. Emma exhaled slowly, releasing the last bit of tension in her body. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small treat, holding it out in front of Duke's nose. Here, buddy. You earned it. Duke hesitated for half a second before finally taking the treat gently from her fingers. She smiled. He never took rewards when he was still in work mode. That was another way she always knew when the danger had passed. Emma sat there for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun soak into her skin. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wouldn't be the last. But she wasn't afraid. She had Duke. And Duke was more than enough. She reached down again, running her fingers over his back, feeling the strength in his muscles. People saw a guide dog. They didn't see what he really was. They didn't know his past. Most people thought guide dogs were trained to do one thing: help their owners navigate the world. And that was true. But Duke wasn't just trained to lead her across streets or help her avoid obstacles. He had been trained for war. Before he had come to her, Duke had served in the military. He had worked alongside soldiers, detecting threats, protecting lives. He had been on missions most people couldn't even imagine. And when his service ended, when they told him his work was done, they had sent him to a new home. To Emma. She hadn't known at first. When she had been assigned Duke as her new guide dog, she had just thought he was different. He was quieter than her last guide dog. More disciplined. More aware. It wasn't until she started noticing the small things that she realized the truth. The way he scanned a room before she entered. The way he positioned himself between her and strangers, always in a protective stance. The way his body tensed at the first sign of a threat. And the way he had taken down a man twice his size without hesitation the first time someone had tried to grab her purse. That was when she knew. Duke wasn't just any guide dog. He was a warrior. And he was hers. Emma sighed and slowly stood up, gripping Duke's harness once more. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "Let's go home." Duke immediately rose to his feet, standing tall, steady. He was always ready. As they walked away from the bench, Emma could still feel the eyes on her. People had seen what happened. They had seen the bikers harassing her, and they had seen how quickly they had backed off when Duke had moved. They had seen the truth. That Emma was not helpless. And Duke was not just a dog. The walk home was quiet, but Emma's mind was still replaying the events in her head. She had known, the moment she heard the motorcycles, that trouble was coming. She had known, when they started talking, that they weren't just making small talk. And she had known, before they even realized it themselves, that they were going to walk away without getting what they wanted. Because Duke had made sure of it. Duke always made sure. When they finally reached their apartment, Emma unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it behind them. She let out a slow breath, feeling the safety of home wrap around her. Duke, ever watchful, moved through the apartment with careful steps, as if checking for anything out of place. When he was satisfied, he returned to her side, sitting down with a quiet huff. Emma smiled and knelt down beside him. "You're the best, you know that," she whispered. Duke tilted his head slightly, his big brown eyes looking right at her. He didn't need words to understand. He just knew. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his soft fur for a moment. Some people had bodyguards. Some people had alarms. Emma had Duke. And there wasn't a single thing in the world that made her feel safer. She didn't need to see to know that. She just needed him. And as long as she had Duke, she would never be afraid. Emma sat on the floor next to Duke, her fingers gently running through his thick fur. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of Duke's breathing. He was relaxed now, his job done for the day, but Emma knew he would always be ready. The events at the park played over in her mind. It had happened so fast, yet every moment was clear. The bikers, their taunts, their laughter, the shift in their tone when they realized Duke was not an ordinary dog. She wondered if they were still talking about it. They had walked away, but she knew that what had happened would stick with them. They wouldn't forget the way Duke had moved, the way he had reacted before they even had a chance to do anything. And they definitely wouldn't forget the fear they had felt. That was the thing about Duke. He didn't need to fight to win. He didn't need to bite, didn't need to bark. He just needed them to know. Emma took a deep breath and leaned her head back against the couch. She could still feel the tension in her shoulders, the way her body hadn't fully let go of the moment. She wasn't scared. She wasn't shaken. She was just tired. It had been a long day. And this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. She had lost count of how many times people had assumed she was weak. A blind woman walking alone? Easy target. At least, that's what they thought. But they never expected Duke. He had saved her more times than she could count, not just from people like those bikers, but in everyday moments too. He had stopped her from stepping into traffic once when a car ran a red light. He had pulled her back from a staircase when someone had carelessly left a bag on the ground, blocking the way. He had sensed when someone was following her late at night, making her take a different route home before she even realized she was in danger. And each time, he had done it without hesitation. Because that's who he was. That's who he had always been. Emma reached for Duke's harness, feeling the sturdy leather beneath her fingertips. She had read about military dogs before, about how their training was different from any other kind of dog. They weren't just obedient. They were strategists. They could think, make decisions, and act on instinct. That was Duke. He was more than a guide dog. He was a protector. A soldier. And he had chosen her. Emma's fingers brushed against his ear, and he leaned into her touch. She smiled softly. You never let me down, do you? Duke didn't move, but she knew what his answer would be if he could talk. Never. Emma sighed and slowly got to her feet. Come on, boy. Time for dinner. Duke followed her to the kitchen, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. She grabbed his food bowl and filled it, listening to the sound of kibble hitting metal. Duke sat patiently, waiting for her command. She smiled. Okay, go ahead. The second the words left her mouth, Duke dipped his head and began eating, his tail wagging just slightly. Emma moved to the sink, grabbing a glass and filling it with water. As she took a sip, her mind wandered again. Would the bikers come back? She didn't think so. But she also knew people like them. They didn't like feeling small. And Duke had made them feel very, very small. She would have to be extra careful for the next few days. Just in case. Duke would be watching. He always was. After he finished eating, Duke padded back over to her, pressing his body lightly against her leg. Emma smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Good dinner? She asked. Duke let out a soft huff in response. She laughed. I'll take that as a yes. The night passed quietly. Emma read for a while, listening to her audiobook as she sat curled up on the couch. Duke stayed close, resting his head on her lap, his warmth comforting. Even in sleep, he was always alert. The smallest sound made his ears twitch. The tiniest movement made his eyes flicker open, just for a second, before he settled again. He was always listening. Always protecting. Emma ran her hand over his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. I don't know what I'd do without you, she whispered. Duke didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was there. And that was enough. Underscore 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 on. The next morning, Emma woke up feeling refreshed. She stretched her arms and sat up, listening for Duke. As always, he was already awake, sitting near the door, waiting for her to start the day. She smiled. "Good morning, buddy." Duke's tail wagged once. She got dressed and grabbed his harness. "Ready for a walk?" Duke stood immediately, alert and prepared. Emma chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes." They stepped outside into the cool morning air. The city was already alive with movement. Cars honked in the distance. People chatted on their way to work. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery filled the air. Emma took a deep breath, enjoying the moment. This was her favorite part of the day. Just her and Duke, walking together, moving through the world as one. She didn't need to see. She didn't need eyes to know that the world was still beautiful. She had Duke. And as long as she had him, she had everything she needed. They reached the park, and Emma slowed her steps. She listened carefully, waiting, wondering. Would the bikers be there? Would they come back? She wasn't afraid. She just wanted to be ready. But as they walked, all she heard was the usual sounds of the morning. Birds. Laughter. Footsteps. No engines. No mocking voices. No threats. Duke walked beside her, calm, steady. Still, she knew he was paying attention. He always did. Emma reached down and stroked his fur. "Looks like we scared them off for good, huh?" Duke didn't respond. But she swore she could feel his silent agreement. She smiled. They kept walking, side by side. Two souls, perfectly in sync. A blind woman and a retired Navy SEAL K-9. No one saw them coming. No one ever did. And that was just the way they liked it. The moment happened in a flash. 1 second, the bikers were laughing, thinking they were in control. The next, Duke moved like lightning. He lunged not wildly, not with anger, but with perfect, trained precision. Every movement was controlled, every action calculated. The leader never saw it coming. Duke's powerful body launched forward, his jaws locking onto the man's arm, not to tear, not to injure, but to bring him down with force. The biker let out a startled yell as his balance gave way, his body slamming into the hard ground beneath him. Gravel scraped against his skin, his jacket twisting around him as he hit the earth with a heavy thud. For a second, he didn't even know what had happened. Then the pain kicked in. "AHH! Get him off me!" the leader shouted, trying to yank his arm free. But Duke didn't let go. He held firm, not biting deep, just keeping him down. Controlling him. The second biker had no time to react before Duke spun, his powerful frame slamming into him. The impact knocked the wind out of him, sending him stumbling backward. His feet scrambled for grip, but it was too late. His legs gave out, and he hit the ground hard. The third and fourth bikers didn't even try to help. They just froze. Their wide eyes flicked from Duke to their fallen friends, pure shock written across their faces. "What the?" one of them sputtered, his voice breaking with fear. This wasn't what they had expected. They had seen a blind woman. A simple dog. An easy target. They had never imagined this. Emma stood still, her grip firm on Duke's harness, her body calm. She wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid. Because she had always known the truth. Duke wasn't just a guide dog. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Duke isn't just a guide dog," she said, her words cutting through the air like steel. "He's a retired Navy SEAL K-9. Trained for combat. Trained for war." Silence. The bikers didn't move. They barely breathed. Duke still stood over the fallen leader, his teeth bare just enough to send a clear message. He hadn't hurt him. Not yet. But if the man so much as twitched the wrong way, he would. The leader gulped, his body frozen in place. He no longer looked so tough. The second biker was still on the ground, panting, hands braced against the gravel as if the world had just spun sideways. And the other two? They were already taking slow, cautious steps backward, their faces pale. Emma didn't move. Duke didn't move. Only the wind dared to stir. For the first time, the bikers saw her. Not as a blind woman. Not as someone weak. But as someone they should never have messed with. The leader, still trapped beneath Duke, let out a nervous laugh. It was forced, shaky. He was trying to pretend he wasn't scared, but Emma could hear the fear in his breath. Okay, he said quickly, his voice rising in pitch. We get it? We'll go. Emma tilted her head slightly. Duke didn't release his hold. The third biker took another step back, raising his hands in surrender. Seriously, we were just messing around. We didn't mean nothing by it. Emma let the silence stretch for a moment. Let them feel it. Then, finally, she spoke. Run. Duke let go. The leader scrambled to his feet so fast he nearly tripped over himself. His face was pale, his breaths ragged. The second biker followed a second later, clutching his ribs as he struggled to stand. Neither of them even looked back. They just ran. The third and fourth bikers didn't need another warning. They bolted after their friends, their heavy boots pounding against the gravel. In seconds, they were gone. The roar of their motorcycles filled the air again, tires skidding as they sped away, their engines screaming like panicked animals. Then, silence. Emma took a deep breath, listening to the emptiness they had left behind. She reached down, running a hand over Duke's back. His body was still tense, his breathing strong, but she could feel the moment he knew. It was over. Slowly, he relaxed. His stance loosened, his ears twitched, and finally, he sat beside her, his job done. Emma smiled. Good boy, she whispered. Duke let out a soft huff, his tail flicking once against the ground. Emma straightened her shoulders. People in the park had seen everything. She could hear the murmurs, the whispered questions, the shifting of feet as people slowly returned to whatever they had been doing before. But no one said a word to her. No one asked if she was okay. Because they already knew the answer. She was okay. She had never needed saving. She had never needed anyone. Because she had Duke. And that was all she would ever need. She turned in the direction of their usual path, clicking her tongue lightly. Come on, boy. Duke rose instantly, falling into step beside her, just as he always did. Just as he always would. They walked away together, side by side. And behind them, the world watched in stunned silence. A blind woman. A retired Navy SEAL K-9. The ones who were underestimated. The ones who were ignored. The ones who, time and time again, proved that they were more than what people saw. Emma's lips curled into a small smile. Because those bikers? They would never forget what had happened today. And if they were smart, they would never come back. Emma walked forward with Duke at her side, her step steady, her mind calm. The world around her slowly returned to normal. The birds sang again, the distant sound of children playing filled the air, and the gentle breeze rustled through the trees. But something had changed. People had seen. They had watched. She could still hear their whispers as she passed by. Some murmured in shock, others in awe. A few had gasped during the encounter, and now they didn't know what to say. She knew what they were thinking. How could a blind woman and her dog take down 4 grown men without fear? They didn't understand. They never did. But that was fine. She didn't need them to understand. She only needed Duke. As they continued walking, Emma's thoughts drifted. She wondered about the bikers. Where they had gone. What they were thinking now. She imagined them speeding down the road, hearts pounding, hands shaking as they gripped their handlebars. They had thought they were in control. That they were the ones who would have the last laugh. But now, they knew better. They had learned their lesson the hard way. And Emma? She wasn't worried. She knew they wouldn't come back. Not after today. They would go home, tell their friends, try to make excuses for why they had run. Maybe they would lie. Say the dog was rabid. Say they had just been joking and didn't want trouble. But deep down, they would always remember the truth. That they had messed with the wrong person. That they had come face to face with something they weren't prepared for. And that if they ever tried again, Duke would be waiting. They reached the far end of the park, where the streets were quieter. Emma took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. She could feel Duke's body relax beside her, but he was still alert, still aware. He was always aware. She reached down and patted his head. "Good job, buddy." Duke let out a soft huff, pleased with her praise. Emma smiled. She hadn't always been this strong. There had been a time when she let the world make her feel small. When she had believed the whispers. When she had thought that maybe, just maybe, she really was helpless. Losing her sight had changed everything. One day, she could see the world. Colors, faces, places. The next, it was all gone. At first, she had been lost. Afraid. The world had felt too big, too dangerous. She had believed what everyone told her. That she would always need help. That she would always be at a disadvantage. That she would never be strong again. Then she met Duke. And everything changed. He had been a mystery from the start. Unlike the other guide dogs she had met, Duke wasn't just calm, he was calculated. He moved differently. He watched differently. He thought differently. She hadn't understood it at first. But then she had learned the truth. Duke wasn't just a guide dog. He was a warrior. A protector. A soldier. A retired Navy SEAL K9. And when they had given him to her, they hadn't just given her a dog. They had given her a second chance. A new set of eyes. A new reason to be fearless. And since that day, she had never looked back. She had never needed to. Because Duke always had her covered. As they walked, Emma felt the world shift again, settling into the quiet rhythm of her normal day. But she knew it would never be quite the same again. The bikers weren't the first to underestimate her. And they wouldn't be the last. There would always be people like them. People who thought strength was something you could see. That only the loudest, the biggest, the strongest looking people had power. They never understood that real strength didn't have to be seen. It was in the quiet. It was in the steady. It was in the ones who didn't need to prove anything. Because they already knew. Emma smiled slightly. She and Duke. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They just kept moving forward. Because that's what they always did. That's what they would always do. They reached home just as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. Emma unlocked the door and stepped inside, Duke following closely behind. The apartment was quiet, familiar. Safe. She let out a slow breath and set down Duke's harness. "You hungry, boy?" she asked. Duke's tail wagged slightly. Emma chuckled. "All right, dinner it is." She went through the motions, pouring his food, filling his water bowl. As Duke ate, she ran her fingers over the smooth wood of her kitchen table. She could still hear the echoes of the day in her head. The laughter of the bikers. The sudden silence when Duke had moved. The fear in their voices. The sound of them running. She wondered if they would ever talk about it again. Or if they would pretend it never happened. Either way, it didn't matter. Because the next time someone thought she was weak, she would remind them. And Duke, he would always be ready. She sat down with a cup of tea, letting the warmth settle in her hands. Duke finished his meal and patted over, curling up beside her chair. Emma reached down and scratched behind his ears. "Good boy," she murmured. Duke let out a soft sigh, content. Tomorrow, they would wake up and do it all over again. And if another challenge came their way, they would face it together. Because that was what they did. They kept moving forward. And nothing would ever stand in their way. The bikers scrambled like scared animals, tripping over their own feet as they rushed back to their motorcycles. Their hands fumbled with their keys, their breath came in quick, panicked gasps. One of them nearly dropped his helmet in his rush to get out of there. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. The sound of engines roared to life, shaking the quiet park. Tires screeched against the gravel as they sped off, their bikes disappearing down the road. Gone. Vanished. Just like that. Emma stood still for a moment, listening as their noise faded into the distance. Duke, always watching, kept his eyes in their direction until the very last sound disappeared. Then, slowly, he sat down, his body finally relaxing. Emma knelt beside him, her fingers running gently over his soft fur. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong beneath her touch. She smiled. "Good boy." Duke let out a slow breath, as if he had been holding it in the entire time. He nuzzled into her hand, accepting her praise without needing anything more. The park was silent for a beat. And then, a single chuckle broke through the quiet. "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen." Emma turned her head slightly. It was a man's voice. Deep, warm, full of admiration. She could hear footsteps shifting, people moving closer, their curiosity pulling them in. Someone clapped. Then another. And another. Soon, soft applause spread through the small crowd that had gathered, growing louder. Emma let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. She hadn't done any of this for attention. She never did. But she wasn't surprised that people had watched. "That was amazing," someone else murmured. "Did you see that dog? He didn't even hesitate. That was like something out of a movie." Emma smiled as she reached down, giving Duke another soft pat. "He's full of surprises," she said. Someone else chuckled. "I'll say. What kind of dog is he?" Emma hesitated for a second. Most people wouldn't understand. They saw a guide dog. A companion. A helper. They didn't see what he really was. They didn't know his past. They didn't know what he was capable of. But today, they had seen just a glimpse of it. She ran her fingers gently behind Duke's ear, feeling the warmth of his fur. "He's my protector," she finally said. Simple. True. The murmurs continued, people whispering among themselves, still stunned by what had happened. Someone finally broke the silence. "I didn't know guide dogs could do that." Emma tilted her head slightly. "They don't," she said. The man frowned. "Then, how?" She smiled. Duke stayed quiet at her side, his head slightly lifted, his body relaxed but always alert. She didn't need to explain. Not fully. The bikers had learned the hard way. And if anyone else ever tried the same, well, they would learn too. Emma gave Duke one last pat, then stood, dusting off her jeans. "Well, that was fun," she said lightly. A soft chuckle rippled through the group. The tension was breaking, the fear melting away. People wanted to ask more questions. But they didn't. Somehow, they knew. This wasn't just any story. This wasn't just any dog. Emma turned in the direction of the sidewalk, tapping her cane lightly. "Duke, as always, rose immediately, stepping into place beside her. She took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp afternoon air. Just another day. Just another walk. Just another moment that had proven what she already knew. People underestimated her all the time. They judged by what they saw. A blind woman. A dog. What could they possibly do? She smiled to herself. They never saw it coming. Emma and Duke walked away from the small crowd, their steps steady and calm, as if nothing had happened. But she knew. Everyone who had witnessed the scene knew. They had all seen something today that they would never forget. As Emma moved along the sidewalk, she could still hear hushed whispers behind her. That was unreal. I've never seen a dog move like that. That woman is fearless. She smiled slightly. Let them talk. Let them wonder. She didn't do this for attention. She did it to survive. Duke trotted beside her, his body brushing lightly against her leg, his presence steady and reassuring. It was moments like this after the chaos, after the danger, that she felt most at peace. Because she wasn't just a blind woman with a dog. She was something more. And Duke. Duke was everything. As they walked, Emma listened carefully. The world around her was returning to normal. The sounds of children playing, of cars in the distance, of birds fluttering in the trees. The bikers were gone, but her mind lingered on them for just a little while longer. Would they tell anyone what had happened? Would they warn others? Would they even be able to explain it? Emma could imagine them now, gathering somewhere, breathless, still shaken. No way, that was just a guide dog. He moved like he knew exactly what to do. Did you hear what she said? He was in the Navy SEALs. Their friends wouldn't believe them. Not at first. Because stories like that didn't happen in real life. Except, this one had. Emma could only hope that the lesson stuck. Because if they ever did try to come back, Duke would be waiting. And next time, they might not get a second chance to run. She reached a quiet street lined with shops and small cafes. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mixing with the warmth of the afternoon sun. Her favorite bakery was just ahead. She paused for a moment, tapping her cane gently before stepping inside. The scent of warm bread and cinnamon filled her senses immediately. Emma, a familiar voice called from behind the counter. She smiled. Hey, Mrs. Lopez. The older woman beamed. Same order as usual. Emma nodded. That would be perfect. Mrs. Lopez moved quickly, bagging up a loaf of fresh sourdough, just like she did every time Emma visited. As she worked, she hesitated. So. I heard a little something, she said, lowering her voice. Emma waited. There were some bikers in the park earlier, Mrs. Lopez continued. People are saying you and Duke, well, she chuckled softly. That you gave them a bit of a scare. Emma smirked. Something like that. The woman shook her head in amazement. I swear, every time I hear about you, it's some new adventure. Emma accepted the warm bag of bread, her fingers curling around it. Not an adventure. Just another day. Mrs. Lopez laughed. Well, if those bikers had any sense, they'll never mess with you again. Emma smiled. Let's hope so. She paid for her bread and left the shop, Duke leading her safely back onto the sidewalk. As they continued home, she let herself enjoy the moment of normalcy. The gentle tug of Duke's harness. The rhythmic tapping of her cane. The simple joy of a fresh loaf of bread in her hands. She didn't need excitement. She didn't need danger. She just needed peace. But peace was something the world didn't always give so easily. By the time she reached her apartment, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. She stepped inside, locking the door behind her with a quiet click. Duke moved through the apartment as he always did, checking, scanning, making sure everything was safe. Only when he was satisfied did he settle down by her feet. Emma let out a slow breath and placed the bread on the counter. Another day. Another challenge faced. But she knew it wouldn't be the last. The world was full of people like those bikers. People who thought they were stronger. People who thought she was weak. They would always exist. But so would she. And as long as she had Duke by her side, she would never be afraid. She knelt beside him, running a hand over his fur, feeling the warmth beneath her fingers. "Good boy," she whispered. Duke sighed in contentment, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. New dangers. New tests. But it didn't matter. Because they would face them together. They always did. And they always won. As Duke walked beside her, steady and calm as always, Emma knew one thing for certain. People underestimated her. They always had. They looked at her and saw only what they wanted to see. A blind woman. Someone fragile. Someone who needed help. They never saw the truth. They never saw the strength she carried inside. But she was used to it. She had spent her whole life proving people wrong. And today? She had done it again. Duke walked in perfect rhythm with her, his steps strong and confident. He was more than a guide. More than a protector. He was her shadow. Her guardian. Her best friend. She reached down and gently ran her fingers over his head. "Good boy," she whispered. Duke didn't need to respond. He just knew. They walked in silence for a while, moving through the quiet streets as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The world felt peaceful again, like nothing bad had ever happened. But Emma knew better. The world was not always kind. She had learned that long ago. She had faced darkness. She had lost her sight. She had struggled, stumbled, fallen. But she had never stayed down. She had always gotten back up. And every time, Duke had been there to help her stand. She thought about the bikers. They had come into that park thinking they were in control. They had laughed at her. Mocked her. Thought she was weak. But in the end, they were the ones who had run. Because they had made a mistake. A big one. They had assumed that just because she couldn't see, she couldn't fight. They had assumed that just because Duke was a guide dog, he wouldn't protect. They had assumed wrong. Emma let out a quiet breath as she kept walking, her steps light but sure. She didn't need to see the world to know her place in it. She didn't need to see danger to know when it was there. She didn't need to see Duke to know that he was always watching, always ready. She had learned something long ago, something that most people never understood. Real strength wasn't about what people could see. It wasn't about muscles. It wasn't about loud voices. It wasn't about size or power. It was about heart. It was about resilience. It was about knowing who you are, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. And Emma? She knew who she was. She was not weak. She was not helpless. She was not afraid. She was strong. She was capable. She was unstoppable. And Duke? He was her partner. Her warrior. Her protector in every way that mattered. They had faced trouble before. They would face it again. But no matter what came next, no matter who tried to challenge them, they would always win. Because together, they were a force no one could break. A blind woman and her dog. A pair that no one ever expected. A pair that no one ever saw coming. Emma smiled to herself, feeling the cool evening air against her skin. She knew the truth. The people who were overlooked. The ones who were ignored. The ones who the world thought were less. They were often the strongest of all. They were the ones who saw the clearest. Even without sight. Emma walked on, her steps sure and steady. Duke matched her pace perfectly, his strong body moving in sync with hers. The air was crisp, the world quiet except for the soft sounds of the city at dusk. The park was behind them now, but she could still feel the energy of what had happened there. The bikers had thought they were in control. They had thought they could scare her. But now, they knew the truth. Emma wasn't weak. And Duke was more than just a dog. She knew that this wouldn't be the last time someone underestimated her. It never was. People always assumed things about her. They saw the cane, the way she moved carefully through the world, and thought they had her figured out. But they didn't. They never did. She had learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for her. She had learned to listen, to sense things before they happened. She had learned to see in ways that most people never would. And she had learned that strength didn't come from what people could see on the outside. It came from something much deeper. It came from knowing who you were. And Emma knew exactly who she was. She was someone who had faced darkness and found her own way through it. She was someone who had fallen, again and again, but had always stood back up. She was someone who refused to be afraid. Duke's tail wagged slightly as if he could feel her thoughts. She smiled and reached down, running a hand over his head. His fur was warm, his body solid and strong. He was always there. Always watching. Always protecting. They walked past the small bakery she loved, and she could hear the quiet hum of conversation inside. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt so normal. She liked that. She liked that even after a day like today, life went on. She turned a corner, Duke guiding her easily past a few street signs and uneven patches of sidewalk. He never hesitated. Never faltered. He was trained for this. For more than this. She had learned about his past the first time he saved her. The way he reacted, the way he moved, it had been too perfect, too precise. She had done her research after that. Had learned that Duke wasn't just a retired service dog. He had been in combat. He had been on missions, protecting soldiers in ways only a dog could. He had saved lives. And now, he was saving her. Every single day. As they neared her apartment, Emma let herself relax fully. She had never been the type to let things shake her, but there was always something about being home that made her feel safe. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, letting Duke walk in first. He always did a quick scan, checking every corner of the small space before settling down. She set her cane against the wall and sighed. "Another day, huh?" she said softly. Duke flopped down beside her feet, letting out a soft huff. Emma smiled. She reached into the small container on the counter and grabbed a treat, kneeling down to hand it to him. "You were amazing today," she murmured. Duke took the treat gently, his tail wagging slightly. She leaned against the couch, stretching out her legs. Her body was tired, but her mind was still awake, still turning over everything that had happened. She didn't regret a thing. She never did. People had always warned her to be careful. To stay home after dark. To avoid trouble. But Emma refused to live in fear. She refused to let the world tell her where she could go and what she could do. She had Duke. And Duke made sure she was safe. She reached for her phone and checked the time. It was late, but she wasn't quite ready for bed. Instead, she turned on some music, letting the soft melody fill the apartment. Duke shifted beside her, resting his head on his paws. Emma ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of his body. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she whispered. Duke didn't move, but she knew he understood. She had learned a long time ago that words weren't always needed. Sometimes, all that mattered was knowing that someone was there. That you weren't alone. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself just be. She had faced the dark. She had come through it. And now, she was stronger than ever. People would always underestimate her. But that was their mistake. Because sometimes, the ones you overlook are the ones who see the clearest. Even without sight.